You won't believe the effect that EMF has on animals. So EMF stands for electromagnetic fields or frequencies. These are the invisible waves that things like cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, chargers, and any other device gives off. So you may be doubting whether EMF has any health effects on humans, but the evidence that EMF has health effects on animals, plants, and insects is indisputable. So in this video, I've got some striking examples for you. Once you see them, you'll be wondering what EMF is doing to you. Let's dive in. So the researcher Favre conducted an experiment on honeybees in 2011. He set up 2 mobile phone handsets near a honeybee hive and had them call each other. He measured effects using audiograms and spectrograms. He found that active mobile phone handsets have a dramatic impact on the behavior of the bees, namely by inducing the worker piping signal. In natural conditions, worker piping either announces the swarming process of the bee colony or is a signal of a disturbed bee colony. So basically, phones made the bees angry. Now imagine what your body is doing when you're in a permanent state of agitation caused by the cell phone sitting next to you. Harst and colleagues conducted a study where they put wireless landline phone stations at the bottoms of the inside of beehives. They found that the beehives without the phone stations had 21.1% more honeycomb by weight than the beehives with the phone stations. It seems that EMF negatively impacted the bees' ability to create honeycomb. The researchers also found that fewer bees returned to the exposed hives, and it took them longer before they did return. There being less bees coming home helps explain why the exposed hives had less honeycomb. A hive cannot thrive if its bees don't come back. Sharma and colleagues measured the effect of cell phone radiation on bee colonies. They took 2 colonies and put a cell phone at each side of them. Twice a week, they would expose the colonies twice a day to cell phone radiation for 15 minutes during peak activity. They had 2 other colonies they did not expose to radiation. They did this experiment over the course of 3 months. The results were astounding. Throughout the experiment, the exposed colonies occupied less space, had fewer broods, fewer eggs, fewer bees returning to the hive, and fewer leaving, less honey and less pollen. At the end of the experiment, the exposed hives had died out. No bees, pollen, or honey remained. To summarize, an hour of cell phone radiation a week for 3 months was enough to collapse a bee colony. It doesn't really take much. Now imagine what your cell phone is doing to your brain. Alright, that's enough about bees. We'll now go over a systematic review by Kukurachi and colleagues, published in 2013 on the ecological effects of radio frequency EMF, RF EMF, between the frequencies of 10 MHz and 3.6 GHz. Things that use this range would be shortwave radio broadcasting, FM radio, police radio, cell phones, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, microwave ovens, and satellite radio, just to name some of them. So a lot of everyday devices are included in this. 113 studies met the research criteria. In 65% of the studies, ecological effects of RF, EMF, 50% of the animal studies, and 75% of the plant studies were found both at high as well as at low dosages. Clearly, the effect EMF can have is not a fluke. It is consistently an influential force in the world, even though we can't perceive it. They found that in studies where significant effects were found, there was on average longer exposure to EMF and greater proximity to the source of it. These factors explain why some studies don't find effects, as they would be using EMF that's too weak. On the other hand, perhaps someone would object that the EMF studies showing an effect are using a level of EMF that is unrealistic and not found in our environment. To this, I would say that certainly not all of them are. Many of them intentionally tried to use realistic levels. Some studies are done outside of the lab in the real-world environment. And any unrealistically high EMF study still suggests that a normal level of EMF is undetectably doing damage to our bodies, which could become detectable after years of chronic exposure, which we are all exposed to. Now, with that objection out of the way, I'm going to hit you with some of the shocking studies from the Kukurachi systematic review. In 2008, Batelier and colleagues studied the effect 2G and 3G cell tower frequencies would have on chicken eggs over their incubation period. They used 4 sets of 240 eggs. Results showed an increased mortality of 42.2% for the embryos exposed to EMF. It's not only your skillet that can fry an egg. Balmori studied the effect a GSM base station, basically a 2G cell tower, has on the breeding of white storks. Storks who lived within 200 meters of the station produced only about half as many fledglings, birds mature enough to fly, as storks who lived a distance greater than 300 meters from the station. There were 40% more cases with the EMF-exposed group where there were no newborn chicks in the nest. So EMF had a major impact on how many chicks and fledglings white storks produced. An interesting study was done by Wright and colleagues on the nesting locations of the birds, the great tit and the blue tit, relative to radiofrequency EMF. The great tit is the more dominant species, so they're going to want the better nesting locations. They found that an average of 50% of the great tits moved from a more exposed section of the study area to a less exposed one. The EMF-exposed nests would be more occupied by the blue tit because the great tit would tend to kick them out of the non-exposed nests. This suggests that these birds do feel the effect of EMF, and they don't like it. A number of studies were conducted on fruit flies and EMF. One study found that the EMF-exposed fruit flies produced up to 50% more offspring than the non-exposed flies. Other studies found that fruit flies exposed to EMF had up to 40% less growth and reproduction. The different ways in which EMF is used can produce wildly different results. Now, I wouldn't mind having some of that fruit fly reducing EMF in my house during the summer. Schwartz and colleagues exposed tobacco hornworms to EMF and found that development, reproduction, and mortality numbers were affected as much as 50%. Whether this was an increase or decrease, I don't know, but that is a huge effect. Vaca and colleagues found that insects lost some of their ability to detect a natural geomagnetic field once exposed to EMF. Kammerertz and colleagues found that ants exposed to EMF had a decreased retention of acquired knowledge and a total loss of visual memory. Lay and colleagues in 1994 found that rats suffer from a deficit in spatial working memory function when exposed to RF EMF, 50% decreased performance compared to controls. Daniels and colleagues exposed rats to cell phone radiation and tested their spatial skills. Their performance was not affected in a water maze test, but the male rats performed significantly worse, 60%, in the open field test. It is very strange how EMF does not affect the performance in one test, but does in a different but very similar test. Balmori studied the effect a field station has on tadpoles. He found that the exposed group showed low coordination of movements and asynchronous growth and a high mortality, 90%. The control group was exposed to the same environmental conditions but placed inside a Faraday cage, which blocks EMF. As a result, the coordination of movements was normal, the development was synchronous, and the mortality rate was only 4.2%. Nichols and Racy used EMF from radar on bats to see if it could keep them away from wind turbines, and found that the exposure of bats to a pulsed wave radar system determined a significant reduction in foraging activity of the bats. EMF also affects microorganisms. A study found that EMF enhanced the growth of the organisms E. coli and the nematode C. elegans. Latvian researchers studied the effects a radio station had on plants over the course of a few studies. They found that the vegetative growth of young plants decreased as a consequence of exposure to the radio station EMF, but the exposed population of adult plants was on average growing 150% more than the control unexposed samples. Furthermore, they found that the structure of the cells of pine needles and cones was significantly altered by EMF. Roxetal and colleagues studied EMF's effect on the cellular stress of tomato plants. There were differences as great as 300% between exposed and non-exposed groups. The authors noted that the results are strikingly similar to those found when plants are wounded, cut, or burned. Moving on from the Cucarachi study, Hillman and colleagues measured the relationship between electrical power quality and milk production from dairy cows. They found that the more electrical abnormalities there were, the less milk the cows would produce. Electricity isn't very stimulating when it comes to milk production. Lee and colleagues conducted a review of the effects of intermediate frequencies of electromagnetic fields on animals. They state that most studies have reported that IF EMFs do not induce any observable adverse effects. However, they cite many studies where there are adverse effects found. I won't bore you with the details of each of these studies, but some of the adverse effects they found include suppressed immune system, decreased testosterone, structural changes in organs, more placental resorption, less body weight, more dead fetuses, less brain mass, more fetal skeletal variations, and impairment in learning and memory. In my mind, that's enough to want to be cautious about EMF, even if most studies don't report any effect. The researcher Balmori notes the following. The orientation of migratory birds is disrupted when very weak high-frequency fields are added to the static geomagnetic field. It was convincingly demonstrated that robins are unable to use their magnetic compass in the presence of urban electromagnetic frequency noise in the frequency range of 2 kHz to 5 MHz. Balmori also notes that the magnetic reception system in monarch butterfly orientation may also be suffering interference with anthropogenic radio frequency magnetic fields, and this, together with other factors, may be a cause of their population decline. As far as birds are concerned, low voltage electricity current generated electromagnetic field can produce a significantly negative effect on the breeding success of birds, Ciconia, nesting directly on electricity lines. And these same results have been found in nests exposed to radio frequency radiation near phone masts. Now let me tell you how EMF affects aquatic life. Popoff has found research showing that migrating fish species such as European eels or salmonids have been reported to slow down their motion or change the direction when crossing sea cables. Other examinations of fish and sea cables didn't reveal much effect. Little skates, which are kind of like stingrays, increased substantially their exploratory and foraging activity close to subsea high-voltage DC cables. Furthermore, embryos of thornback rays reduced their ventilation as a reaction to electric field stimuli which resembled the presence of a predator. The edible crab preferred shelter exposed to static magnetic fields of several millitesla over an unexposed shelter and over freely roaming within the experimental area. In contrast, spiny lobsters avoided a shelter with a strong magnetic anomaly in a laboratory setting. Bodewine and colleagues completed a meta-analysis in 2019 on frequencies in the intermediate frequency range, and concluded that the evidence for adverse health effects of fields in the IF range, intermediate frequency range, is inadequate for drawing a conclusion. They identified methodical flaws in the majority of studies which lowered the credibility in the reported results. An additional analysis revealed that high-quality studies tended to report no effects of IF exposure, while moderate and low-quality studies were more likely to report biological effects of exposure. Accordingly, of all first-tier studies, only 30% reported an effect of exposure. In contrast, 62% of studies placed into second tier and 70% of all studies placed into third tier reported biological effects of exposure. So the authors in this meta-analysis really try to downplay the effect of EMF, but even if we only accept the first tier studies, 30% of them showing an effect is still significant. Speaking of the research out there, Balmori notes that the rate of scientific activity regarding the effects of anthropogenic electromagnetic radiation in the radio frequency RF range on animals and plants has been small, despite the fact that this topic is relevant to the fields of experimental biology, ecology, and conservation due to its remarkable expansion over the last 20 years. So basically, he's saying that we have all these EMF generating things like Wi-Fi, cell phones, cell towers, radio stations, Bluetooth, chargers, computers, cars, and microwaves. And there is exponentially more and more of these things over time, but there is a suspicious lack of research on this topic. I wonder why. Now, if you're wondering why EMF is able to have effects, I can answer that. The possible mechanisms behind EMF deserve their own video, but suffice it to say that electromagnetic fields act to be an activation of voltage-gated calcium channels. Changes in the size of the magnetic granules upon applying additional magnetic field to the cells of Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, were observed, and this size fluctuation triggered the increase of calcium intracellular. Therefore, we may hypothesize that some of the disruptive effects of radio frequency fields on the orientation of animals may be related to the interference with calcium channels. So basically, EMF can cause there to be too much calcium in the wrong places at the wrong times. That is all the research I have for you in this video. There should be no doubt that EMF is negatively impacting life on this planet. Intuitively, it doesn't feel like cell phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, radio stations, power lines, etc. are hurting anything, but they are. Companies and governments can say all they want about safe levels, but they are wrong too. Our environment is being destroyed and nothing is being done to stop it. And if EMF is harming the environment, you can be sure it's doing the same to us. And of course, the worse the environment is, the worse things will be for us. If EMF, for example, is reducing the bee population, then that's going to make food more expensive and less available to us. It's hard to say what we as individuals can do to stop EMF from harming wildlife, but spreading knowledge about it is a great first step. If you want all of my recommendations on how to protect yourself from EMF, as well as a full diet and supplement guide, along with tips to improve your sleep and reduce your environmental toxin exposure, come join my paid online community where I will personally be there to answer your questions and you will have the support of other individuals seeking to improve their health. Link is in the description. If you thought this video is valuable and you would like to support me, smash that like button, subscribe, share, and post a comment. The more you help my channel, the more we can help the world become healthier. Make the healthy choice, especially when you don't feel like it.